Hello and welcome back to Dukascopy TV. Now, the Cyprus bail-in saga was deemed by many as a credible solution to save big bank failure without needing taxpayers' money. But to others, it's also deemed as, well, basically grand theft. Here to discuss which side of the fence he sits on is David Smith, founder of the Geneva Business Insider. David, thank you very much for coming in.
Pleasure to be here once again. Thank you very much.
Now, bail-out is a word that we're quite familiar with. We've had Greece, Spain teetering on the edge for quite some time. But bail-in as such, we're not really familiar. The Cyprus situation was the first time this term was used. So could you remind us, if we just backtrack a little bit, remind us what the situation actually entailed, David, please?
Well, let's take bailout first of all, very briefly. I mean, a bailout is basically using taxpayers' money to bail out financial institutions. So in a way, it basically adds to the national debt, and it is a way of theft from the current generations and future generations. However, it is done through the mechanism of supposedly deferred taxation. If we look at the bail-in mechanism, basically what it says is that every bank has on one side of its balance sheets assets, which are loans to clients, it's investments, etc. And on the other side of the balance sheets, it has the shareholders' funds, it has bondholders' investments, and it also has depositors. Now, basically, depositors can be anything from large corporations to small individuals and pensioners who have accumulated and saved that money over their lifetime. So if what happens is that a bank decides unilaterally to bail in, it basically is another form of authorized theft, because you were taking money directly out of the pockets of people who, for the most part, thought that that money was actually held on a secure and fiduciary capacity by the bank, whereas in fact it amounts to an unsecured loan to a very, very highly leveraged institution. So that is the real problem with the bail-in.
Now, importantly, it would seem that this model's been used for the first time where banks were too big to fail, according to some. But actually, it would seem that that's not the case at all, that banks aren't too big to fail. What do you think of that statement?
Well, banks, the concept of a bank being too big to fail, I think, is already a disgrace, because basically these are the same institutions that demand that their clients make available the security that's necessary to protect the bank from loss. However, the bank thereafter can take any resources they want and squander it whatever way they want, or make irresponsible crony capitalist investments, which was a great case in Cyprus, and then expect all of a sudden that the citizens should come along and be bailed in, so to speak, in order to get the banks out of trouble. Now, if we take the other country which has faced this issue, which was Iceland, a tiny little country, their approach was to say, instead of bailing out the banks, we will bail out the citizens and make sure the citizens are protected, and we will prosecute the bankers and the politicians who create this and put them in prison. So basically, we have a completely upside down, corrupt, crony capitalist society where phrases like too big to fail come into existence. These things should never exist in the first place. Now,
the bail-out was obvious, or the bail-in, however way you want to put it, was half and half really, but it was obviously very controversial at the time. There has been some discussion as to whether it would act as a precedent for other countries. Is it something that you think that, looking back a couple of months later, with hindsight really on your side, would you really think that we'd be doing this again? It could actually happen again?
Yes, you have to look at it like this. Banks, like everybody, think about their personal survival before anyone else. In fact, what they do is they think about the survival of their top executives before anything else. And to achieve that, they manipulate the politicians and use the taxpayers' resources to do it. So that is a fundamental problem with a bail-in, with a bail-in. So if you look at, will this situation be repeated? The answer is the only place they can steal money from is from depositors. So yes, of course they will do it. And what the public is not aware of is that this has been the situation for a long time. There had been, for a number of years now, a couple of years back, there were steering committee meetings organized by the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, where all of the major banks were involved in discussions as to how this bail-in could be achieved. And the person who was conducting those negotiations, for example, for Switzerland, was none other than Mr. Roth, the former head of the Swiss National Bank, who obviously after retirement could never be actually left off the payroll and continues no doubt to get consulting fees for doing work like this. Now, if you then go around the world, you will find that enabling legislation exists in America, in Canada, it's being put in place in Australia as we talk. It exists in Switzerland because the Banking Act was modified to allow bail-ins. So what you're having at the moment is a conspiratorial action by all of the banks, and aided and abetted by the politicians, putting the laws in place to make bail-ins not only acceptable, plausible, but the only way forward. And what will no doubt happen at some point in a not too distant future is that it will be a big long bank holiday, and all of a sudden you'll wake up with half of your deposits on your bank accounts taken away in order to refund and save certain banks. Now, if you look at the banks that are most likely to fail at the moment, the one which is most leveraged of all, which is actually finally getting a little bit of headlines in the newspaper, is Deutsche Bank. So there we have the bastion of economic stability, namely Germany, with the most bankrupt, over-leveraged hedge fund style bank in Europe.
It is very, very interesting, and there's a lot obviously that goes on behind the scenes, but there are so many factors at play. If you think about timing, money, and how the banks actually go about herding around this cash, what other factors would you say play?
Well, I mean, if you look at what's happening at the moment, there is an attack, particularly on Switzerland, but also on most of the offshore locations for money. And basically, the idea is let's take America, which is the prime mover in this at the moment. It is to terrorize people out of offshore locations into their own home countries, and repatriation of money, and of course. The objective there is to make sure this money lands up in US banks. So if you want to have a theoretically offshore structure, the best place to have it now with the least supervision and scrutiny is of course in America. So you go to Nevada, you go to Delaware, where you don't even have to present a passport to open a bank account, whereas in Switzerland they run around like headless chickens, ticking in boxes that are 15 pages long in order to open an account or decide not to do so. Mm-hmm. So what you're having is large outflows of money from, countries which have a relatively sound regulatory environment like Switzerland into countries which clearly don't, like the UK, which is another great example as the money laundering centre of the world, or to the US. And if the money then lands in these big US and UK banks, then my goodness, aren't those banks happy, because they'll have that much more money to chop for their own interests at the end of the day.
Bank runs, everything like that. We could discuss this for hours on end, I'm sure, David, but thank you so much for coming in today and putting your perspectives forward. Thank you.
Well, I hope people have listened and take very seriously what I have to say. Otherwise, they're going to wake up one morning and find their bank accounts have been emptied.
David, thank you for coming in once again. Been a pleasure.
Pleasure as always. Thanks a lot.
Well, that's all from myself and David for the moment. Don't forget, we have MJT in the studio later on, as usual, for a Monday. But for now, goodbye.